On the Eastern Front, where Nazi Germany clashed brutally with the Soviet Union, female Soviet soldiers risked more than just life and limb. The Nazis, driven by a toxic mix of sexism and ideology, subjected these women to unspeakable acts of cruelty, stripping them not only of their uniforms, but of their humanity. For a soldier of the Red Army, being taken prisoner was not an option. Most would be tortured, executed, or worked to death by their Nazi captors, while those who survived the notorious prisoner of war camps were often declared traitors and collaborators when they were eventually released. Female Soviet soldiers were especially vulnerable, and many faced a fate worse than death in a Nazi POW prison system. 800,000 women served in the Soviet military during World War II, making up 5% of all military personnel, or 1 in every 20 soldiers. Most served as medical staff, such as nurses and doctors, though there were many who took an active frontline role, serving as snipers, tank crew members, partisans, and pilots. Many women also served as partisans in the various communist resistance movements and found themselves harshly treated by the Axis powers if ever captured. Operation Barbarossa, the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union, commenced on the 22nd of June 1941. This invasion took the Soviet Union by surprise. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact had been signed on the 23rd of August 1938. This treaty ensured peace between the two parties and outlined how the lands of Eastern Europe and the Baltics would be divided between the two. Thousands of women volunteered to fight for the Red Army, but were initially rejected. Unaware and unprepared for a war with Germany, the Soviets suffered defeat after defeat. Over half of European Russia was occupied, which included almost half of the entire Soviet population. It was only then that women began entering the ranks of the Red Army en masse. Flintenweiber. The first female volunteers were kept away from frontline combat on the belief that they could not operate as effectively as men. Women working as medics or anti-aircraft gunners slowly proved their worth in combat, showing the Soviet military leadership that they were no less effective than the men. The female ranks swelled as the war went on, and by the end, there were roughly 500,000 serving in the Soviet armed forces at any given time. Various orders were given during the war specifically dictating the treatment of female Soviet soldiers. On the 29th of June, 1941, German Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge issued an order to execute every captured female soldier. This order was quickly rescinded, but individual commanders continued to enforce the order. Only months later, a similar order was issued by Field Marshal Walter von Reichenau, ordering the summary execution of all captured female partisans. The wording of these orders shows the disdain that was held for these women, such as this order given to the 4th Panzer Division in October 1941. Insidious and cruel partisans as well as degenerate broads don't belong in a POW camp, but hung from the nearest tree. Those female Soviets who escaped execution were, however, no luckier than those who were. Germany at the time was built around strict principles dictating the positions of men and women within society. To the German forces at the time, a female fighter was an abomination, carrying out a task only suitable for men. The disdain held for these female soldiers is illustrated by the term used for them. Rather than Soldatinnen, the word for a female soldier, they were called Flintenweiber. It literally translates to riflewoman, but Weib, meaning woman, is a derogatory term. The presence of women in the Soviet military was seen by the Nazis as evidence of the moral corruption of Bolshevism, as it placed women into a position antithetical to their natural position within society. One order given for their summary execution reads, "Womenfolk in Russian uniforms are to be shot immediately on principle." Female POWs. Over the course of the war, around 6 million Soviet soldiers were captured, including many women, with around half dying in captivity, either from starvation, disease, or murder. The conditions for these female prisoners were horrific. Much like the concentration camps, these conditions were intentional and were used to slowly starve the inmates to death, as, like the Jews of Auschwitz, they were deemed racially inferior and a blight to German racial purity. The conditions they were kept in were much worse than those of the camps holding British or American prisoners of war, who were deemed to be more racially acceptable. All Soviet prisoners were treated harshly, Not only were they purposefully starved and emaciated, they were frequently beaten, tortured, and humiliated in front of their comrades. But female POWs, due to their status as Flintenweiber, were especially vulnerable. The female soldiers were seen as a threat to the moral purity of the Nazi ideology, and they were punished accordingly by the camp guards. Large numbers of Soviet women were abused sexually by camp guards, with no ability to protect themselves. In February 1943, 500 female Soviet soldiers were transported to Ravensbrück concentration camp after refusing to work in the German arms factories. Naked, covered only by blankets, they marched into the camp in lockstep, as if they were on the parade ground. Those at Ravensbrück recall how confident they marched, not allowing their captivity to ruin their military discipline. They ignored orders of the SS guards, only complying when their commander gave them the orders herself. These were only a small number of Soviet women who ended up at Ravensbrück and other concentration camps. Here, they suffered just the same as the Jews, the political prisoners, the gypsies, and anyone else unfortunate enough to have been imprisoned there. Many unethical medical experiments were carried out on the female prisoners at Ravensbrück, including Soviet prisoners of war. The first experiments were carried out in 1942, testing the efficacy of the antibacterial drug sulfonamide. The leg bones and muscles were cut and purposefully infected with bacteria. Sometimes pieces of wood and glass were inserted into the wounds to increase the chance of infection. Later experiments studied the body's ability to regenerate bones, muscles, and nerves, as well as experimenting with bone transplants between people. 11 of the victims died, either from their wounds or execution following the experiments, while the rest were left with serious and permanent physical damage and disability. At least 4 victims survived long enough to testify at the Nazi doctor's trial in 1946. In one instance, the women of Ravensbrück banded together to put an end to the forced medical experimentation. A petition was signed by all those who had survived experimentation and sent it to the camp commander. After the women assembled outside the commander's office, an office worker was sent out to tell them that the tales of experiments were nothing but old wives' tales. After passive resistance, it seemed like the experiments had ended for good until one day 10 women were called up. The other women of their blockhouse tried to conceal them, but the 10 were discovered and taken one by one. The 10 women were taken to a separate bunker, while the others were locked inside for 3 days, deprived of fresh air, light, water, and food. Over those 3 days, the 10 women were experimented on, without anesthetic or even a proper operating room. The women were held down by SS guards who operated on their leg bones and muscles. These were the final medical experiments at Ravensbrück. Many of the inmates were also forced into sexual slavery, as near the end of the war, Ravensbrück provided the women for most of the army-operated Nazi military brothels. These brothels were intended to help raise the morale of German troops far from home, and to prevent them from having relations with women in the occupied territories. By 1942, the Nazi forces had established over 100 brothels in the occupied territories of both Eastern and Western Europe. The conditions were terrible. The brothels operated for less than 7 hours every day, but in this time a woman could be forced to sleep with as many as 32 men. While the Nazi authorities did conduct routine medical tests, venereal disease was common, as well as physical abuse from the male patrons. Female captives, especially those from Ravensbrück, were also sent to work in concentration camp brothels. Here they were intended to increase productivity among the male workers by allowing them access to women. In some cases, at the behest of Heinrich Himmler, these women were also used in an attempt to convert homosexual prisoners, who were sometimes ordered to attend the brothel at least once a week to teach them the joys of the opposite sex. These concentration camp brothels were not widely used, however. The main patrons were the green men, real criminals, such as murderers or violent gangsters, who received their name from the green badges they wore. Jewish prisoners were prohibited from using them, as Jewish women were prohibited from working in them. Soviet martyrs. Zinaida Portonova was a Belarusian partisan who joined the resistance movement in 1942, aged only 16. Initially distributing propaganda leaflets, she eventually learned to handle weapons and began sabotaging important military assets, such as local power plants and pumping stations. Eventually, she gained work in a kitchen in Obol, catering to Nazi soldiers. She poisoned large amounts of food, and after escaping arrest by consuming the poisoned food in front of the Nazi authorities, she went on the run recovering from the poison by drinking large amounts of whey. After 5 or 6 months, she returned to Obel for partisan activities, but was swiftly captured. She managed to escape, but was captured again. She suffered horrendous torture, but when the Gestapo officers realized no amount of torture could get her to speak, she was taken into the woods and executed, less than a month before her 18th birthday. Zoya Kosmodemyanskaya was another young Soviet partisan who joined shortly after the outbreak of Operation Barbarossa. Her partisan unit was also involved in sabotage, such as cutting German communication lines and laying mines. Still, in November of 1941, they were ordered to burn down the village of Petrishchevo, which was occupied by a German cavalry regiment. After burning down 3 houses, the German occupiers and unhappy locals formed a militia and captured Zoya. She was stripped naked, interrogated, and viciously beaten. Her body was burnt all over, and she was subject to 200 lashes of a whip. Eventually, she was paraded through town wearing a sign that read, "House burner," and hanged.